My guardians invited me to a family celebration, but when I arrived, they told me there wasn't a seat for me. My cousin smirked. Only immediate family gets a spot. I nodded and walked out. The next day, they showed up at my door, begging. I, 29M, never thought I'd be writing this, but after what happened last week, I need to get this off my chest. Some of you might think I went too far, but honestly, I'm not sure I care anymore. My parents died when I was 12 in a car accident. My aunt and uncle took me in, and I've lived with them ever since. They had their own son who was 2 years older than me, and while they never treated me badly, there was always this subtle difference in how they handled things. Small stuff, like how his achievements got framed and hung on the wall while mine got a pat on the back. How family photos somehow always had me standing slightly to the side. I graduated college last year with a degree in computer science and landed a decent job at a tech startup. Been saving up to move out, but the housing market is brutal right now. My aunt mentioned they were planning a big family celebration for my uncle's promotion to partner at his law firm. She told me it would be this Saturday at their country club and that I should dress nice because some important people would be there. I spent money I didn't really have on a new suit. Took the day off work. Even got my hair cut at an actual barbershop instead of the usual chain place. This felt important somehow, like maybe this was their way of finally including me as real family. Saturday came and I drove to the country club. The place was fancy, way fancier than anywhere we'd ever gone as a family. Valet parking, marble floors, the works. I walked into the private dining room they'd reserved and saw about 30 people already seated around this massive table. Everyone was dressed to the nines, laughing and chatting. My aunt spotted me first and walked over with this weird expression on her face. She told me there had been a mix-up with the seating arrangements, that they'd miscounted and there wasn't actually a spot for me at the table. I looked around and saw empty chairs, but she quickly explained those were being saved for people who were running late. My cousin appeared beside her with this smirk I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. He looked me up and down in my new suit and said that this was really more of an immediate family thing anyway, that only blood relatives and their spouses got seats at the main table. He suggested maybe I could grab dinner somewhere else and catch up with them later. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The fancy room, the perfectly set table, the family I'd lived with for 17 years treating me like an unwanted party crasher. My uncle was across the room talking to some colleagues and hadn't even acknowledged I was there. I told my aunt I understood completely, that it made perfect sense. I walked out without another word. The drive home was a blur. I sat in my car in their driveway for probably 20 minutes, just staring at the house where I'd spent most of my life. That's when something clicked. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was done. I went inside and started making phone calls. First, I called my uncle's firm. Told them I needed to speak with someone about a client matter. When they transferred me to the managing partner, I explained that I was calling about my uncle and some concerns I had about his handling of my parents' estate. See, here's the thing nobody talks about. When your parents die and you're a minor, there's usually life insurance money, property, assets that get held in trust until you're old enough. My uncle had been managing all of that as my guardian. Every year, he'd give me a basic rundown, telling me the money was being invested wisely, and I'd get access when I turned 21. Except I turned 21 8 years ago, and every time I asked about it, he'd say the investments were doing well and it was better to leave everything alone for now. That I'd get it all eventually, but the market timing wasn't right. I'd never pushed hard because, honestly, I trusted him. He was family. He was a lawyer. He'd taken care of me when nobody else would. But sitting in that car, I realized I'd been an idiot. The managing partner was very interested in my concerns, especially when I mentioned that I'd never received any formal accounting of the trust, never signed any documents as an adult, and had been essentially locked out of information about my own inheritance for 8 years. He told me they'd be conducting an immediate internal review and that I should come in Monday morning with any documentation I had. Next, I called a family law attorney I'd found online, left a detailed voicemail about my situation, and asked for a consultation first thing Monday. Then I did something that felt both petty and necessary. I logged into my uncle's home computer. He'd never changed the password from when I was in high school. Started taking screenshots of everything I could find related to my parents' estate. Bank statements, investment accounts, property records. What I found made my stomach drop. My parents had left me everything. Their house, which had been sold. life insurance policies worth over $400,000, investment accounts that had grown substantially over the years. All told, I should have been sitting on close to $700,000. Instead, I had about $3,000 in a savings account that my uncle had opened for me in college. I spent the rest of the weekend documenting everything, taking photos, printing records, building a timeline. By Sunday night, I had a folder thick enough to choke a horse. Monday morning came, and my uncle left for work like nothing had happened. My aunt was doing laundry and humming to herself. My cousin was still asleep because he'd been out late celebrating his dad's promotion. I went to my meeting with the family attorney first. She looked through everything I'd brought, and her expression got darker with each page. She told me this was one of the clearest cases of financial elder abuse and breach of fiduciary duty she'd seen. That what my uncle had done was not just unethical, but criminal. She said we could file both civil and criminal complaints, and that given the amount of money involved and the length of time this had been going on, I was looking at potentially getting back not just the original amount, but significant damages and interest. The meeting at my uncle's firm was even more interesting. The managing partner had already started his own investigation based on our phone call. Apparently, my uncle had been using his position as my guardian to make some very questionable investment decisions with my money. Investments that happened to benefit some of his other clients. They told me they were suspending him immediately pending a full investigation, and that they'd be cooperating fully with any legal proceedings. I drove home that afternoon feeling like I was in a dream. In the span of one morning, I'd gone from being the unwanted family member to holding all the cards. My uncle's car was in the driveway when I got back. So was my cousin's. I walked in to find all three of them sitting in the living room with these shell-shocked expressions. My uncle started talking immediately, said there had been some misunderstanding at his office, that someone had made some very serious accusations about his handling of my parents' estate. He wanted to sit down and go through everything together, clear the air. My aunt jumped in, saying how much they loved me and how I was like a son to them. That family was the most important thing, and we needed to stick together through this difficult time. My cousin, who had been so smug 2 days earlier, was suddenly very interested in making sure I knew how much he'd always considered me his brother. I listened to all of this and then told them I needed to think about everything, that this was a lot to process and I wanted some time to figure out the best path forward. The relief on their faces was almost comical. What they didn't know was that I'd already made my decision. Update 1. The next few days were surreal. My uncle kept trying to corner me for private conversations about working things out as a family. My aunt started cooking all my favorite meals and asking about my day like she hadn't seen me in years. My cousin actually offered to help me move out, saying he'd found some great apartment listings in my price range. It was like watching people perform a play where they'd forgotten their lines. Wednesday morning, my attorney called. The criminal investigation was moving forward faster than expected. Apparently, once they started digging into my uncle's client files, they'd found a pattern of similar behavior with other estates he'd managed. I wasn't his only victim. She also had good news about the civil case. My uncle's firm was so concerned about their liability that they were already talking settlement, not just for the original amount, but for damages, lost investment opportunities, and legal fees. She estimated I'd be looking at close to $1 million when everything was said and done. That afternoon, I got a call from my uncle's managing partner. They wanted to meet with me again, this time with their legal team. My uncle had been officially terminated, and they were trying to get ahead of the criminal charges. I scheduled the meeting for Friday morning. Thursday night at dinner, my uncle finally cracked. He started talking about how the family needed to stay united, how outside forces were trying to tear us apart. He said he'd made some mistakes with my money, but that his intentions had always been good. That he'd been trying to grow my inheritance and had gotten in over his head with some investments. He promised he'd make everything right if I would just talk to the lawyers and tell them this was all a misunderstanding. I told him I'd think about it. Friday's meeting was everything I'd hoped for. My uncle's firm was terrified of the publicity this was going to generate. A respected law firm stealing from orphan clients wasn't exactly the kind of story that stayed quiet. They offered a settlement that would give me everything I was owed plus substantial damages, in exchange for keeping their name out of any criminal proceedings. My attorney advised me to take it. The money would be in my account within 30 days, and I'd still be free to pursue criminal charges against my uncle personally. I signed the papers that afternoon. Update 2. When I got home Friday evening, all three of them were waiting in the living room again. This time they looked desperate. My uncle had clearly heard about the settlement from his former colleagues. He started begging immediately. Said he knew he'd made mistakes, but that he'd always thought of me as his son. That he'd been trying to protect me from making bad financial decisions when I was younger, and then things had gotten complicated. My aunt was crying, saying she'd had no idea what he'd been doing with my money. That she'd trusted him completely and felt betrayed too. She begged me not to destroy the family over this. My cousin took a different approach. He got angry, saying I was being vindictive and that this was about more than money. That I was trying to get revenge for every perceived slight over the years, and that I was going to destroy his father's career and their family's reputation over something that could be worked out privately. I let them all finish talking. Then I told them exactly what was going to happen. I was moving out immediately. I'd already put a deposit down on a condo across town and would be gone by Sunday. The criminal investigation would proceed regardless of any settlement, because what my uncle had done wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. And as for the family, well, they'd made it pretty clear at the country club that I wasn't really part of it anyway. My cousin lost it completely. Started yelling about how I was being a spiteful little kid, how I'd always been jealous of their real family, how I should be grateful they'd taken me in at all instead of letting me go into foster care. My uncle told him to shut up, but the damage was done. I looked at all three of them and realized I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a kind of empty relief. I told them I'd be staying at a hotel for the weekend and would be back Sunday with a moving truck. That they should use the time to figure out how they were going to explain to their friends why I wouldn't be at any more family celebrations. Update 3. Moving day was awkward but efficient. I'd hired professional movers and had everything packed and out of the house in about 4 hours. My aunt tried one last time to convince me to stay, saying we could work through this as a family. My uncle mostly stayed in his study, probably talking to lawyers. My cousin wasn't there. Apparently, he'd gone to stay with friends for the weekend because he couldn't handle the drama. The criminal charges were filed the following Tuesday. My uncle was arrested at his new job, a small firm that had hired him after his termination. The story made the local news that evening. Prominent attorney charged with embezzling from orphan ward. The reporter mentioned that there might be other victims. My phone started ringing immediately. My aunt, my cousin, even some extended family members I hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to know if there was anything they could do, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. I didn't answer any of the calls. 3 weeks later, my uncle pled guilty to avoid a trial. He got 2 years in prison and 5 years probation. He also had to pay restitution to me and the other families he'd stolen from, though most of that was covered by the settlement I'd already received. My aunt filed for divorce 2 months later. Apparently, she'd had no idea about the extent of his financial crimes, and the shame was too much for her to handle. She moved back to her hometown to live with her sister. My cousin sent me a long email about 6 months later. He apologized for what he'd said that last night, and for how they'd treated me at the country club. He said he understood why I'd done what I did, but that he missed having me as a brother and hoped we could reconnect someday. I never replied. It's been almost a year now since all this happened. I bought a house with the settlement money, invested the rest, and I'm doing well. I've made new friends, started dating someone who doesn't know anything about my family drama, and I'm genuinely happy for the first time in years. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled everything, if I think I went too far, or if I miss my family. The truth is, I don't think about them much anymore. They made their choice that night at the country club when they decided I wasn't worth a seat at their table. I just made sure they understood the consequences of that choice. I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation or who took you in when you had nowhere else to go. It's about respect and love and treating people like they matter. And by that definition, I never really had a family to lose in the first place. So no, I don't regret anything. Sometimes the best revenge is just walking away and building a better life without the people who never valued you anyway. But sometimes, when they've stolen from you and lied to you and treated you like garbage for years, the best revenge is making sure they face the consequences of their actions. I'm sleeping just fine at night.